Katharine Drexel was born into a wealthy family and decided to use her time and fortune to educate Native and African Americans, two groups of Americans who, at the time, people did not see as worth educating. Despite many oppositions, she founded many schools and missions which provided education to these groups. Her most notable achievement being the founding of Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana, the only historically black and Catholic university. Katharine Drexel was declared a Catholic saint as a direct result of her efforts and helped to create changes in the way Native Americans and African Americans were educated. When the United States began to put Indians on reservations because of treaties, Native American children were sent to government boarding schools to help them become more like modern Americans so that the Indian problem would be solved. The schools taught them skills such as farming, blacksmithing, and carpentry for boys, and sewing and household work for the girls. President Ulysses S. Grant saw that the treaty system wasn't working for most Indian tribes, so he came up with what became known as the peace policy. This system stated that different Christian groups would be allowed to educate Native Americans in their beliefs, and no other religion could establish a mission there. The country was a Christian-dominated country, most of these people being Protestant. The Catholics then did not have as many Indian groups under their care, and sought a greater balance between the denominations. Although this policy was designed to bring peace, it only brought more chaos, which led to its end 8 years later. African Americans didn't fare much better. The end of the Civil War in 1865 meant that they had new rights and opportunities protected by the Constitution, such as voting, owning property, and an education. In the South, and to a smaller extent in the North, many facilities were separated into African American and white. In the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court decided that separate but equal facilities were acceptable. In education, this meant that African American students would be forced to go to separate schools from the white students. This is the cultural and political atmosphere into which Katharine Mary Drexel was born in Philadelphia on November 26, 1858. She was the second child of a wealthy banker, Francis Anthony Drexel, and Hannah Langstroth Drexel. Hannah died 5 weeks later. 2 years later, her father married Emma Bouvier, who would be the only mother Katharine would know for the rest of her life. She had two sisters, Elizabeth and Louise. It was the period of 1879 to 1883, while helping nurse her mother through her final illness, that Katharine started to think about a religious life. In 1894, Francis and his daughters took a trip out west, visiting several Indian missions. One of the very first things Katharine did to benefit and help Native Americans was to use her allowance to purchase a large statue of the Virgin Mary for one of the Catholic chapels. 2 years after the Drexel girls' mother died, so did their father. He gave away over $1 million of his $15 million estate to his favorite charities. The rest was for his daughters. And if all of his daughters died childless, the remaining money would go to the charities specified in his will. In 1886, Elizabeth, Louise, and Katharine traveled to Europe. While in Rome, Katharine was able to get a private audience with Pope Leo XIII to ask him to send more missionaries to help staff the missions in the United States. She got a very surprising answer. Quote, "Why not, my child, yourself become a missionary?" Unquote. Pope Leo XIII, January 1887, during a private audience with Katharine Drexel. She returned to the United States a few months later, and after consulting with her spiritual director, Bishop O'Connor, and much prayer, she entered the Sisters of Mercy Convent as a novice on May 8, 1889. She had special training to help her prepare for founding and heading a new religious order. She took her vows on February 12, 1891. She founded the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament for Indians and colored people. Katharine opened her first school for Native Americans in 1894. St. Catherine's School in Santa Fe, New Mexico, served the Pueblo Indians. The opening of this school marked the beginning of what would be a long life of hard work and dedication on Katharine's part, opening many other mission schools across America. Much of Katharine Drexel's work was not appreciated. Cecilia Murray, author of the article Katharine Drexel Learning to Love the Poor, displayed an example. Quote, "Dressed in their new habits for the first time, the sisters attended the cornerstone laying for St. Elizabeth's, unaware that some sticks of dynamite had been found nearby. As would happen all too frequently in the future, some neighbors were not happy about the sisters' focus on the Indians and colored. Unquote. Opposition rarely occurred to the establishment of mission schools for Native Americans, but much opposition occurred to her starting schools for African Americans. Several groups, including the infamous Ku Klux Klan, did not want her to start up schools for the African Americans. In the South especially, Klansmen threatened the church and many of her schools. None of these attacks drove the sisters away from their task. Although most of her opposition came from her founding schools for African Americans, there was some resistance from the local Indian tribes on the reservations where she founded her schools. Some of these Native Americans were not happy that there were so many people trying to educate their children in the ways of the white man. One of Katharine Drexel's biggest achievements was the founding of Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was the only school for African American Catholics in the country. Construction started in 1915 on a site where the previous Old Southern University stood. Due to the strong opposition in the South over African American education, the plan for what the site was going to become was kept secret until it was finalized. It was completed a few years later under the banner of Xavier Academy, changed to Xavier College, and finally Xavier University. In 1935, Katharine suffered a severe heart attack. After the heart attack, she had to resign from her post as Superior General of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. Mother Mercedes was elected to succeed Mother Katharine. The Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament began to expand their outreach to larger cities, such as Chicago and New York, after Mother Katharine's resignation. The sisters continued to educate both African and Native Americans until laws were passed that gave both races educational rights and freedoms. In 1955, the sisters suffered the loss of their founder, Katharine Drexel, at 96 years old. With her passing, they lost the Drexel wealth to the charities specified in Francis Drexel's will. Despite this, they continued to serve the Native and African Americans in their community and throughout the country, and still thrive today. On May 17, 1954, as a result of the landmark court case Brown v. the Board of Education, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that separate but equal was no longer acceptable. This was a major win for the civil rights movement and a big one as well for the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament and their efforts to educate all children equally. With the success of the civil rights cases and the overall change in how Americans were educating all children, the need for separate institutions like the Indian boarding schools began to diminish. The sisters began to educate a new group of children, the poor. Their current mission statement describes how the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament continue their ministries today. Quote, "As Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, we believe God calls us to be a sign in the world of the power of the Eucharistic Christ, to effect unity and community among all peoples. Guided by the spirit of Katharine Drexel, we are called to share the gospel message with the poor, especially among the Black and Native American peoples, and to challenge the deeply rooted injustice in the world today." Unquote. In 1964, Katharine's cause for beatification was introduced by John Cardinal Kroll. When Robert Gutherman was miraculously cured of an inner ear injury due to prayer to Mother Katharine, she was beatified in 1988 and became known as Blessed Katharine Drexel. When Amy Wall was cured from being deaf, also due to prayer to Katharine, it was announced as the second miracle needed for Katharine to be declared a saint. She was announced as Saint Katharine Drexel, patron saint of philanthropists and racial justice, on October 1st, 2000. 34 schools and parishes currently operate under the name and spirit of Saint Katharine Drexel, including Xavier University. Her spirit of generosity and outreach to the underprivileged are still alive today. Katharine Drexel was born into a wealthy family and decided to use her time and fortune to educate Native and African Americans, two groups of Americans who, at the time, people did not see as worth educating. Despite many oppositions, she founded many schools and missions which provided education to these groups. Her most notable achievement being the founding of Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana, the only historically Black and Catholic university. Katharine Drexel was declared a Catholic saint as a direct result of her efforts and helped to create changes in the way Native Americans and African Americans were educated.